Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College. Welcome to our discussion of On Revolution, part of the virtual reading group. Today we are reading really the two central chapters of Arendt's book, chapters 4 and 5, that have both the title Foundation 1 and Foundation 2. The first one, chapter 4, we're reading is Constitutio Libertatis, and the second one is the Novus Ordo Secularum. These two chapters go together. They are, in my mind, the two most important chapters of Hannah Arendt's political thinking. They are about revolution, but they are about more than revolution. They are about the possibility for founding legitimate power in the age where authority in its absolute, traditional, and religious forms has broken down. How do we create a new and legitimate and just and free government in a world without traditional absolute sources of authority? It's the question these two chapters take on. And Hannah Arendt thinks that the United States government, in its experience during the revolution, happened upon an answer. Now, I say happened upon, and I don't mean just accidentally, because she thinks that they were prepared for it for two reasons. First, because of their experience in politics, in the colonies, and in the states in which they engaged self-government and thus prepared themselves for the experience of acting jointly together with others, which is how she thinks power emerges. And the second is that they also were reading the classic tradition about politics and understood in some way the need that all revolutions and all modern governments have for two things: the constitution of power and the constitution or the foundation of authority. And these two chapters are, in a sense, or actually not in a sense, they are broken up largely along these two lines. Chapter 4 is the constitution of liberty or freedom, and thus at the core of that idea of freedom is power. And so the general argument of chapter 4 is that what the Americans did is find, discover, create, develop, think about these words, a new concept of power, one that had never before been fully articulated in a political system. And that this new concept of power, which came out from below, from the townships and the experience of self-government, protected America from the great evil of sovereignty and thus absolutism that had plagued other governments. And that the second development, which is that whereas other countries had sought to find authority, thus the justification for its new system of power, its legitimation, in an absolute source like the will of the people, one that therefore could become sovereign. The Americans found a new and different source of authority, one that was not unified and sovereign. And that new and radically American source of authority um, was to be found in the Supreme Court as it emerged as not only the highest institution of interpreting the Constitution, but as itself a continuation of the moment of founding, the constitutional, she calls it a constitutional convention in continuous existence. And it is this almost supernatural belief, faith that the Americans came to have in their Supreme Court as not just the highest authority, thus a sovereign authority, but as a continuation of that constitutive moment that provides a break on power, but also a justification for the power that was created. That is the new American idea of authority, which she thinks is taken from Rome and the Roman Senate, but is transferred from this democratic idea of the Senate to the legal idea of the Supreme Court. And so chapter 4 is about the constitution of power, and chapter 5 is about this constitution of authority. And today we're discussing chapter 4. It's really broken up into 3 parts, although I would argue that there's a 4th part at the very end that is about this distinction between power and authority. But the first part is on the Constitution and the importance of constitutions in a revolution and in the foundation of a free republic. So on page 132, Arendt writes, "For in America, the armed uprising of the colonies and the Declaration of Independence had been followed by a spontaneous outbreak of constitution making in all 13 colonies, as though, in John Adams' words, 13 clocks had struck as one, so that there existed no gap, no hiatus, hardly a breathing spell between the War of Liberation, which was the condition for freedom, and the constitution of the new states." So a few things here to remember. One is, remember, she makes a distinction between liberation and freedom. Liberation is the liberation from a monarch or a tyranny. Freedom is the constitution of a new republic. And as soon as the colonies were liberated, the first thing they did, she says, is begin writing, making, and instituting constitutions. And this, for her, shows the centrality of constitutions in the United States. Now, what is a constitution? Well, she says there are 3 different definitions of a constitution. One is that a constitution, in its sort of most traditional sense, is simply a commitment to limited law, limited government, a government limited by law. So on page 134, she says, quote, "The notion of constitutional government is, of course, by no means revolutionary in content or origin. It means nothing more or less than government limited by law and the safeguard of civil liberties through constitutional guarantees, as spelled out by the various Bills of Rights, which were incorporated into the new constitutions, which are frequently regarded as the most important part." So a few things here. She's talking about not just the U.S. Constitution, but all the constitutions in all the 13 colonies. And that's a very important part of her work. And in all those constitutions, they had Bills of Rights, different ones in each one, which was originally left out of the federal and then added, as I'm sure you all know. For her, this idea of the Constitution as a limit and as a moderating force on the will is one idea of the Constitution. But there's another idea, which is an idea she takes from Thomas Paine, in which she writes, "The act of constituting as well as the law of rules of government that are constituted, namely a constitution, is the verbal act, not just the law that limits, it's the act of constituting, to setting up, ordaining, and establishing." And in this sense, the Constitution is what constitutes. So Paine writes, a constitution is not the act of a government, but of a people constituting a government. And so she wants to focus on the fact that immediately once they were liberated, the colonies all began constituting themselves. It was an act not just of a limiting document, but an act of setting up how we're going to live together. And then this really does bring us to the third idea of constitution, and the one that she is most interested in, which is that a constitution for her, at least in the United States and now as a model, is an entirely new system of power. So on 138 she writes, the actual content of the Constitution was by no means the safeguard of civil liberties, but the establishment of an entirely new system of power. So we need to take seriously and ask, what does she mean? And actually, most of the rest of this chapter is an attempt to simply explain what she means in this sense. What is the entirely new system of power that the Americans developed and discovered in their experience of constitution making? She writes on page 140, the aim of the state constitutions which preceded the Constitution of the Union, whether drafted by provincial congresses or by constitutional assemblies, as in the case of Massachusetts, was to create new centers of power after the Declaration of Independence had abolished the authority and power of the Crown and Parliament. So note, the Declaration had abolished the power and authority, right? And we're going to have to recreate both power and authority. That's the two chapters. The aim of the state constitutions was to create new centers of power, not authority. And this is part of her argument. Authority is eventually going to be found in the federal constitution, national constitution, and in the Supreme Court. But the state constitutions was really focused on power. And this is important for her because one of the absolute crucial things she wants to say about power is that power is supposed to be multiple. It's supposed to be plural. We need many sources of power. To have one source of power is to risk sovereignty and thus tyranny. And so she says that it's not an accident that the framers really built their thinking not on Rousseau, like the French, but on Montesquieu. And that Montesquieu's key discovery for her was that what he calls the grand temple of federal liberty, federalism, must be based on the foundation and correct distribution of power. And so she writes on 142, Montesquieu's discovery actually concerned the nature of power, and this discovery stands in so flagrant a contradiction to all conventional notions on this matter that it has almost been forgotten. Most ideas about power see power as something that's dangerous, and thus that we should limit, and absolute power corrupts, or power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so constitutions are about limiting power, right? That's the first definition of constitutions. What Montesquieu understood is that in order to have liberty, freedom, you need not to limit power, but to multiply it, to diversify it, to, in Arendt's words, pluralize it. And he knew, right? She quotes Montesquieu again. She said on 141, Montesquieu had maintained that power and freedom belong together. That means you can't get freedom by limiting power in this old constitutional sense. You actually need, in order to get freedom, to expand power. But then power could become dangerous. And so how do you limit this expansive power? Well, you can't rely on laws, she says, because most of the time, power will run roughshod over laws. And so how do you limit power? Well, you don't limit it. What you do is you multiply it so that no one power can overawe all the others. There's a clear Lord of the Rings Arendtian moment here. The fear of the one power and the need for multiple kingdoms, multiple states, multiple institutions, the plurality of powers. On page 149, she writes, "The discovery contained in one sentence spells out the forgotten principle underlying the whole structure of separated powers, that only power arrests power. That is, we must add, without destroying it, without putting impotence in the place of power. Laws are always in danger of being abolished by the power of the many, and in a conflict between law and power, it is seldom the law which will emerge as victor." So this is the Montesquieu insight that she thinks the framers and the Americans, somewhat theoretically, but mostly through experience, really understood. And thus she adds, and this is, I think, really one of the most important lines in Arendt's thinking, on page 144. "In this respect, the great, and in the long run, perhaps the greatest American innovation in politics as such, was the consistent abolition of sovereignty within the body politic of the Republic. The insight that in the realm of human affairs, sovereignty and tyranny are the same." What Arendt understood is, in human affairs, you cannot allow one power to rule the others. That's tyranny. And the only way to limit that power is not through laws, but through the multiplication of powers. And so on 145 she concludes, "Clearly the true objective of the American Constitution was not to limit power, but to create more power, actually to establish and duly constitute an entirely new power center, destined to compensate the Confederate Republic, whose authority was to be exerted over a large and expanding territory for the power lost through the separation of the colonies from the English crown." So now, to move to the American Constitution from the states, we have the 13 states, they each have power, and now we create one other power, not to overrule them, but to balance them out. And so what you have are multiple power sources, right? State, federal, local, that all for her are balancing and limiting each other. This is what she thinks the separation of power means, not Congress, President, Supreme Court. Yeah, that matters. She's not opposed to that. It's important. But much more important is this decentralized, anti-sovereign, federalist principle. Within that, she understands that the question emerges how a new power source becomes legitimate, and this is the question of authority. And so, in part 2 of this section, which is somewhat of a digression and a preparation for chapter 5, she raises the question of the need of an absolute authority. And she says on page 149, quote, "that the problem of the absolute is bound to appear in a revolution, that it is inherent in the revolutionary event itself, we might never have known without the American Revolution." She says on 152, "The need for an absolute manifested itself in many different ways, assumed many different disguises, and found different solutions. Its function within the political sphere, however, was always the same. It was needed to break two vicious circles, the one apparently inherent in human lawmaking, and the other inherent in the petitio principii, which attends every new beginning, that is, politically speaking, in the very task of foundation." So every revolution needs to answer the question of authority, and there's two parts. One is the source of the law's authority, or the legitimacy of the laws, and the other is the source of government authority, or the legitimacy of a new power. And she says the French seemingly solved this problem by turning to the people as the source of authority. The problem with the people, the nation, is that it is an absolute. It is all the people seen as one, as a singular voice. And this, she says, is the solution to the problem of an absolute authority that almost all revolutions in the modern age have followed. In part 3 of this chapter, she says the real alternative, the only alternative, the sole alternative to that idea of absolute authority, of centralized authority, is the federal system. So on 157, she says, not only was the federal system the sole alternative to the nation-state principle, it was also the only way not to be trapped in the vicious circle of pouvoir constituant and pouvoir constitué. And this is just simply to say, we have this problem of how we are going to legitimate the new power and legitimate the power that legitimates the new power. And the only way to do that, aside from the nation, is the federal system, the federal principle, decentralization. And so on 157, she articulates this further. What was lacking in the old world, in France and the European nations, were the townships of the colonies. And seen with the eyes of a European observer, quote, the American Revolution broke out, and the doctrine of the sovereignty of the people came out of the townships and took possession of the state. She's here, of course, citing Tocqueville, for whom the spirit of freedom in the townships, which stood against, as he calls it, the civilizing spirit of the elites and the center. This power that comes out of the townships didn't exist in Europe. And so the new power had to be discovered and authorized from above. Whereas only in America at this time, since the power came from below, it didn't need a higher authorization because it came from the people, the ground up, in different power centers. And this, thus, is the sole alternative to the way of authorizing the new American idea of power. On 157, she writes, quote, what the American Revolution actually did was to bring the new American experience and the new American concept of power out into the open. So there's this new experience and new concept. She's really more interested in the experience. She thinks the Americans didn't act through concepts, but she wants to articulate both. And this new experience and concept of power, she says, like prosperity and equality of condition, this new power concept was older than the revolution, but unlike the social and economic happiness of the New World, which would have resulted in abundance and affluence under almost any form of government, it would hardly have survived without the foundation of a new body politic designed explicitly to preserve it. Without revolution, in other words, the new power principle would have remained hidden. This new experience and concept of power, which emerged organically through the townships, needed the revolution to preserve it, because it was in the revolution that this new concept of power became articulated and manifest in a governing system. And this power, as she says on page 158, as the men of the American Revolution understood it, this power, as a matter of course, they understood it because it was embodied in all institutions of self-government throughout the country. It was there. It was in the way they organized and governed themselves before the revolution. And she traces it all the way back even to the Mayflower Compact. And she says on 158, the really astounding fact in the whole story of the Mayflower Compact is that their obvious fear of one another, these people huddled together on these ships coming to found a new country, not sure what would happen when they did, their obvious fear of one another was accompanied by the no less obvious confidence they had in their own power, granted and confirmed by no one, and as yet unsupported by any means of violence, to combine themselves into a civil body politic, which held together solely by the strength of mutual promise in the presence of God and one another, supposedly was powerful enough to enact, constitute, and frame all necessary laws and instruments of government. These people on the ship get together and say, we have the power. We're confident that we have the power to constitute ourselves and promise each other to live in a certain way. And her conclusion from this is that we then may say that the specifically American experience on the Mayflower, in townships, in self-government, in state constitutions, this specifically American experience of constituting, of joining together, of mutual promising, had taught the men of the revolution that action, though it may be started in isolation and decided upon by single individuals for very different motives, can be accomplished only by some joint effort in which the motivation of single individuals, for instance, whether or not they are an undesirable lot, no longer counts, so that homogeneity of past and origin, the decisive principle of the nation-state, is not required. The joint effort equalizes very effectively the difference in origin as well as inequality. It's in this experience of acting together with people of all different backgrounds, obviously at this point not as different as we are today. It was mostly white and male. But it was this experience of acting together with people who nevertheless had different experiences, different classes, different educations, and this effort equalizes this difference, and we find a common thread. We find a common belief in the power we have to govern ourselves. And she says this is the realism of American democracy, that there's a faith that we have, that we're all not good. Not, the men of revolution in France, they thought they were good. Here, we don't think we're good. We think they're sinful. But we think that if we act together in concert, we can create a community that binds us together. This joint action that binds different, plural, disagreeable people who may not be predisposed to like each other, religious fanatics, humanitarians, humanists, teachers, farmers, lawyers, baseball players. This joint action that binds them together, she says, creates this new community. And then she creates this wonderful idea of the grammar of action, like the grammar, that which connects the different parts of a sentence together. But now we're talking about the grammar of action, how action holds a sentence together in structure. She says the grammar of action is the only human faculty that demands a plurality of men. Right? That's clear. When you act with people who are different from yourself. And the syntax of power, that power is the only human attribute which applies solely to the worldly in-between space by which men are mutually related. So in power, we come together in this worldly space and we act in concert with each other and create new centers of power. So grammar, action, which is this plurality, this faculty of man, and power, where we come together and act together, she says, combine in the act of foundation by virtue of the making and keeping of promises, which in the realm of politics we may well be the highest human faculty. So action and power together lead to the foundation and the emergence of a new politics, namely one of freedom. This really is the core of, and I think you can find in these few pages the mature thinking of Arendt on the possibility of founding a free politics in a plural world. The chapter ends in a few pages. I call this part 4, although she doesn't distinguish the part, and it's where she transitions into the question of authority. She now says explicitly that both power and authority are needed for Republican freedom, and that while power was readily available to the Americans in this experience of the federal principle, the true problem, the most difficult problem of the American Revolution, was how to reconstitute authority when there was no absolute authority of king, religion, tradition there. And she says on 169 to 170, quote, "Finally, it was experience, the unified wisdom of North America, collected in a general Congress, rather than theory or learning, that taught the men of the Revolution the real meaning of the Roman potestas in populo, that power resides in the people." So that's the first half of the quote. Right? It was experience that taught us that in the end, power has to come from the people. The second part, she says, she continues, "They knew that the principle of potestas in populo is capable of inspiring a new form of government, only if one adds, as the Romans did, auctoritas in senatum, authority resides in the Senate, so that government itself consists of both power and authority, or as the Romans had it, senatus populusque Romanus, or SPQR as it's popularly known, the Roman Senate and the people." And what Arendt is here saying is that that popular saying, SPQR, actually reflects the dual need for both power and authority. And that the Romans saw power in the people and authority in the Senate. And what she's going to argue in chapter 5 is that what the Americans did is discover a new seat of authority, not in the Senate, but in the Supreme Court, as part of the Constitution, which now is a living Constitution, not in the way that a lot of people say it today, but in that it lives and continues to develop and offer authority, but tied always back to the authority of the founders and tradition. And so on page 170, she says, "The chief problem of the American Revolution turned out to be the establishment and foundation not of power, but of authority, because power was more readily accessible to the Americans through their experience of power, and authority was what really had to develop." And that we'll talk about in the next session in chapter 5. Enjoy reading on Revolution. Thanks very much.